So this is going to get into a little bit more of the technical aspect of managing pests in edible landscapes, but also managing clients, and again getting back to that idea of managing their expectations and also having them understand that the trade-off between using conventional pesticides and using organic controls is really one of time and sort of vigilance. So we'll get to it. All right, so I'll talk about designing edible landscapes for beauty and function, pest control in edible landscapes, and then also sort of just developing an informational infrastructure, just something I'm going to touch on at the end. If this is something you're looking to get into, just kind of having some supporting materials that are specific to your region that could help, either if they're something that Extension puts together or Master Gardeners or your individual business, will really kind of help create that baseline information that you're going to need to have to be able to get out to clients to support them in participating in this work with you. So edible landscapes can take a lot of different forms. A traditional plot, just kind of like a row garden like my dad had when I was a kid. Raised beds, which a lot of people are into because you can, you get the benefits of improved drainage, the soil warms up fast, you can create them out of entirely imported soil if your soil's no good. You can integrate, or you can do sort of more traditional landscaped. So you have, instead of having just a rectangular raised bed, you can have sort of sinuous edges. Oh, thank you, Krista. Or whatever your design fits, but do it with edibles rather than with your traditional landscaping ornamentals. Or you can integrate edibles into a mixed landscape. There's also things getting a little bit further into people who are trying to be subsistence on their land. So there's things like edible food forests is a permaculture design, which is a multi-layered story of fruit trees and berries. That's something that I haven't gone into, and I do know I just came across a business in Asheville, North Carolina, that gets more into that sort of permaculture, trying to develop your land into providing a full diet. That's just not really the type of clients that I work with. Is not really relevant in an urban landscape, and it's also, like I said, I'm kind of targeting people who are new entry into gardening, but I will give you some ideas of what these different types of edible landscapes look like that I've worked with. So traditional plot, this was a client that this was a bed that they had put in, and they had grown the year before I started interacting with them, and they just kind of popped in everything. There's no real differentiation between the planted space and then the walking space. And I don't typically do things in like a big plot row garden. I tend to do more of the wide bed planting. So anybody who I interact with that has a space already established like this, I just subdivide it into wide beds. And for good reason. I mean, when they came to me, they're like, well, the cucumbers took over everything, and it just, at the end, we didn't know what was what. So I just think subdividing into wide bed planting just keeps things more organized. There's space for your feet, and you can access the beds from all sides and from a good reach-end distance. So they were really happy with how that kind of improved upon their success. And this was one that they did entirely by them. I gave them the plan, and then they did it by themselves. Raised beds, so just some of the design constraints. Maximum width of 4 feet, just to have a 2-foot reach-in distance. If you're working with kids, 3 feet might be the max that you can comfortably do. A raised bed does not have to be framed by some sort of hard boundary, but if you're working with kids, or if dogs are a factor, that hard boundary might be a good idea. And usually when I install these, I do them lasagna garden style. So I'll put cardboard or 6 sheets thick of newspaper down on the bottom, and then especially if you're able to do it in the fall, leaves, compost. If you have some topsoil to throw in, leaves, compost, topsoil. Usually sprinkle a little blood meal over the leaves, wet everything down, let it sit. You might have to top it off in the spring because it'll settle, but that's usually how I establish those. I was talking with, I don't know your name, David, who was giving me some new information that I was not aware of certain elements that do build up if you're using leaves as the main source of your organic matter. So that might be something to consider. But I find that that's a good fairly low labor intensive way of doing my raised beds. So this is the garden at school. This is before we finished our rainwater harvesting arbor. But yeah, the raised beds, they're just a good practical way to define this is where your feet go and this is where your feet do not go. Landscaped, sort of more traditional landscape style, food only edible landscapes. If you're going to be doing intensive planting, create lots of edge for accessing your plants. So this is actually my house. A lot of the pictures are from my house because I'm there most often. So it's kind of hard to see, but the edge kind of goes like this so that I can reach in. And this is, again, kind of taken from permaculture, the idea that you have a bed you can access at all sides and build up your soil. You get both the increased planting surface area from that sort of curved mound. That's pretty subtle unless your beds are really raised up. But also you get the drainage, and you can really plant intensively in that space without having to have one row and then a space for your feet. But still having some sort of bed structure so that I can set up beds grouped by families and rotate. And I'll talk a little bit about rotation later. You can also integrate edibles into mixed landscapes. And I actually don't have any pictures from my own clients with this. This is from Rosalind Creasy, who wrote a book about edible landscaping. My clients that I've done plans for them for this, but it tends to be very simple, like here's plants, here's where to tuck them in. And if they have the few that I've done this for, they just go for it themselves, and I haven't been back. So, but this, you can see she has some peppers here. That looks like a black opal basil, sage. That might be lemon basil. It's really hard to tell. But also some lovely. Those look like they might be some rudbeckia natives, as well as other ornamentals. There we go. So designing for these different landscapes types. But if you're really looking at an edible landscape, something that is an attractive landscape made primarily of edibles, like I said in the first talk, keeping the beds full is something that's going to be kind of a challenge to getting an aesthetic that's similar to what people are looking for out of a landscape. So you want to create some structure using woodies and perennials. So vegetable plants tend to be pretty short. So tomato plants can be tall if they're trellised up, and you can create trellises. And I'll talk about that in a bit. But you can use berries for some upright structure. Sometimes need to be trellised. So blueberries, raspberries, if you trellis them up. Grapes. This is at school, and when I look at that, I'm like, gosh, those kids are so lucky. And then, so they create some structure, but then also perennials that will pop up early in the spring and have something in the garden before the rest of your annuals go in. Rhubarb is lovely, asparagus, and then your perennial herbs. I notice I didn't say fruit trees. I haven't gone there with any of my clients yet, especially because, like I said, most of them are interested in using organic methods. And in Maryland, and wouldn't be surprised the same here, we have really humid summers, really hard to grow fruit organically without a lot of sort of deep knowledge of what to be looking for, as well as sort of the pruning. So it might be, if somebody wants to go there, I'm willing to do it, but I think that the small fruits are a great point of entry, and that's kind of what Extension, shares with people, the kind of philosophy they share with people as well. I have an espaliered peach tree in my backyard, which I got to watch the squirrels eat my first 3 peaches of this year. This was its 3rd year, so it did produce some fruit, but I'm sure they were delicious. So, if you're doing edibles only, you can also help to keep your beds full by using long veggies with a long attractive season. All right, and so this is going to be a lower maintenance solution than the next thing that I'm going to talk about. And really, if you think about it, a lot of these are things that have been adapted for ornamental use. So there's ornamental cabbages and ornamental kale, sweet potato vine we've all seen. Well, they're maybe you don't have the diversity of colors and stuff to choose from in the edibles, but the edible version is lovely. And they're in the ground for a long time, so you're not going to be getting the early harvest off of them. But something like okra, which has these gorgeous hibiscus-like flowers, does have once it does start producing, will produce till first frost, and it's a really interesting plant. And you know, carrots can be used as a nice border, such nice soft feathery foliage. So that's going to be a little bit lower maintenance in terms of keeping those beds full, because they'll be there for a long time. All right, a little higher maintenance is making sure you're doing relay planting. So this is when something comes out, you're ready to put the next thing in, and best done if you have seedlings ready to pop in rather than direct seeded. So just some useful combinations. Usually in my lettuces, I plant my tomatoes among my lettuces, so that as the tomatoes grow up, they shade the lettuce as it starts to get hot out, and then by the time the tomatoes have really kind of developed a canopy, the lettuce is done. The timing is good for when my garlic comes out. It's time to put my sweet potatoes in, and the sweet potatoes fill out fairly quickly and create a nice ground cover. And then spinach, when it comes out, you can fill in with Swiss chard and beets, and they will last all season long. I do mostly leaf lettuces rather than head lettuces because of this idea of keeping the beds full, because you can get 2 or 3 cuttings depending on how tolerant you are for tough, bitter leaves, which I have a fairly high tolerance for. You can get 2 or 3 cuttings off of one sowing of lettuce, and that time for them to jump back up is pretty short. I mean, in 2 weeks, it'll be looking good again. And just really beautiful foliage, some nice oak leaves in different colors. This one I put up there, this is a romaine varietal, but I think it might have be the prettiest head of lettuce I've ever grown, so it gets a special picture up there. But primarily I do leaf lettuces, because you don't pull the whole thing out and then have a blank space in your landscape. And lettuces are great to plug in to mixed ornamental beds as well. So if you're mixing edibles into a traditional landscape among your ornamentals, again, things with a long season that they'll be in the ground, things with a low pest pressure, not just because, if you're putting it in among your front border beds, you're going to be a little bit more concerned with the looks of it, but also things, if you have peonies, they tend to get powdery mildew, which will hit right on your cucumbers as well. So that sort of jump between ornamentals and edibles does happen, and things that are attractive. So these are some of my favorites, and you're going to notice that Swiss chard comes up all the time because it's great and it's beautiful. But also chili peppers are nice plants. The foliage stays looking nice, a lot nicer than tomatoes do. And once you can get beautiful colored chili peppers, and they will produce till first frost. Onions and leeks. Onions sometimes tend to flop over late in the season, but I wish I had a better picture of this bed. But this looked really nice this year. It was the tall blue. It was a blue solace leeks which were kind of the tall sort of frondy leek leaves surrounded by the more feathery carrot leaves. Garlic's nice, especially if you get hardneck garlic, which produce the scapes, which look nice, but then you also can cut them and eat with them way before your garlic's ready to be harvested. And then perennial herbs also have a lot of value as ornamentals. That you can get beautiful variegated varieties of sage, different growth forms. So oregano, you can get creeping forms as well as more mounded forms. And they're the first things to pop up in the spring, so they're always there. And plus they also have a lot of value that I'll talk about a little later in covering up the sweet, delicious smells of your produce from pests. You want to avoid indeterminate tomatoes. They just look scraggly. If your goal is to have this look nice, they're just going to grow, and by they look gorgeous in June, but they just look like a wreck by the time August rolls around. There are some nice determinate varieties that do a little bit better. Rutgers is a nice one that I use. It's a determinate variety. But it's a nice red slicer. It looks that it stays pretty nice. Also potatoes. I love growing potatoes. Love the treasure hunt. They look like crap. You just don't. You're doing it if you want. If your goal is the food. Cucurbits in general, there are just so many pests and so many diseases that they get, that if your goal is the aesthetics, I might avoid them, and especially the vining ones. And then corn. Corn's one that you're not going to get much yield off of anyway, so it's more just something that I have people who have kids and they want to grow a couple of stalks of corn. If that's what you're going for, that's fine, but it's not going to look good in your front bed. No matter what type of growing you're doing, trellising is a great way to maximize space and create visual interest. And I was talking to a few people in between during lunch, and even though I know that in this part of the world space isn't a limiting factor, and I said this in the first talk as well, not only from a sort of a maintenance, keeping it in a small space helps, I also think that design-wise, if you want something, if you want to try to create a space as opposed to just creating a garden, create some sort of limiting factors for yourself, because otherwise you're just it's going to end up looking like a little farm, which if you're going for a landscape isn't, you want to create a sense that this is a space, this is my vegetable growing space in my yard, and it's a place that you want to be in. So those vertical elements are going to help to kind of define that space. So you definitely need to trellis peas. My client built this. I was very proud of him. Out of bamboo to trellis your peas, pole beans, and tomatoes. Got to figure out a way to keep them up there. I do my tomatoes. I always love seeing how people trellis their tomatoes, because there's anything under the sun. Some people don't do it at all. I build just cylinders out of concrete remesh, 6-inch concrete remesh. I find that they're the only thing that's the only thing that's like sturdy enough I can just pop it on, and I know it's not going to fall over in the, once the tomato gets really rangy. I don't know who invented those little conical wire things, but has there ever been a tomato plant that's really been legitimately supported? I've actually seen people lay them on their sides and let tomato plants just flop over them, because it just keeps the fruit off the ground to some extent. But as far as keeping the whole plants up, it's kind of useless. It's a good option for cucumbers, winter squash, small melons, and mini pumpkins. So any of your vining cucurbits, just to keep them off the ground and create better airflow to help avoid some of those diseases. And I have found that my clients, of course, because they're all concerned about their footprint and they're trying to be efficient, that really what they're looking for is recycled materials and sort of creative repurposing of things. There's a place in Baltimore called the Loading Dock that's an architectural reclamation place. And I know there's one in DC. I don't know if there's anything similar on here, but it's like a excellent, it's like a gold mine for finding creative trellising. So, I find all these wrought iron pieces that I can lean against a fence and let stuff just climb up. My client just had a piece of lattice lying around. She didn't have anything to do with it, and so I've just built a little A-frame for her. I use a lot of bamboo. It's cheap. I feel good about cutting it down because it's an invasive. But it's, I definitely doesn't have to be fancy. I was looking at some of these gardening magazines, and I was like, you want people to pay what for these trellises? And like I said, I think my clients are kind of into this sort of whimsical look of kind of reappointed materials, bed frames and things like that I've seen used. And when you're doing design, there's definitely the extras that can be added in here, because remember, folks are interested in organic gardening and sustainability. Drip irrigation, like I said, I almost insist that people get that. I remind them that they will go on vacation. The company that I use is called DripWorks, and I know that there are lots of them out there. The reason and this is just such a good example of how far customer service goes, when you work with them for the first time, they have a thing that you can email them if it's drawn to scale, a very simple drawing of your garden layout, and they will send you back a drawing of your design for drip irrigation, as well as a spec sheet for what you need to order. And after that, I was like, oh, I know how to do this. Like, I could figure that out. But I will always order from them because it's just really excellent customer service. And I believe that they do work with sort of commercial scale stuff, but they have kits of sort of like they call it the heart of the garden, and it's like the all the fittings that you need to set up your basic layout, and then you just add on your emitters. But like I said, and it's not expensive. I think for my yard I spent maybe $150, and for school it was maybe $200. So rain barrels as well. That's my rain barrel. It's not the prettiest one in the world. Could maybe screen it a little with some bamboo, but definitely get them up off the ground. I was in a place when I was kind of doing environmental education work for a while, where we were building all these rain barrels, and I'm like, yes, I have saved exactly 55 gallons of water from being run off in the Chesapeake Bay, and then the rest of it will go out the overflow tube, because they're not set up in a way that it makes it easy to use that water. For every 2.4 feet off the ground, you get a pound of pressure. So you can, there are emitters. Now that's not enough pressure to get you use like T-tape or the drip tube, the quarter-line drip tube that I use in vegetable gardens, that it's at like 8-inch spacing. But they do have ones that are low-pressure emitters that if you were doing like a border bed or something, that you could run off of rain barrel, and that's how we do it at my school. I've also done a couple of outdoor sinks, and this, I bought that, or no, that sink was the sink I pulled out of my house. The one I did at a client's house I got from the loading dock, which is the architectural reclamation place. When people have it, they love it. And you know, it's a part of like an outdoor kitchen, but really having a place to wash your hands or to wash your vegetables and eliminate that dirt falling in and out. So those are just some extras that you can design for, especially if you want to make sure that you're making this an economically viable business venture, adding those things on.